This episode is sponsored by Fuli Gemstones.
Well, I've been reminded just how complex and varying and in some senses contradictory that the nature of snake is. It's fear, it's beauty, it's evil, but it's health, isn't it, as well? It's the beginning of life, it's the end of life.
I love their livery, their coloured skins, their smooth, sinuous movement. If they didn't have to feed on live animals when in captivity, I think I would also consider having them as a pet.
Welcome to If Jewels Could Talk. I'm Carol Woolton, the voice of Jewellery, an author, broadcaster, and the woman who initiated the role of jewellery editor at magazines like Tatler and British Vogue. This is a podcast for everyone, for people who do like jewellery, for people who don't realise they like jewellery, and anyone intrigued by fascinating facts, new ideas, and forgotten histories. So please join me as I tell sparkly tales, meeting all sorts of people, delving into 4 centuries of jewellery culture and investigate what's happening now. I'm joined today by one of the best-known figures in the art world, Philip Mould, OBE, dealer, gallery owner, art historian, writer and star of BBC's Fake or Fortune. And we're joined by the jewellery historian Amanda Triossi, who's a curator and lecturer on the history of Western jewellery design. And together we are going to unravel the sinuous patterns of the snake in the history of art and jewellery. Hello, Philip. Thank you so much for joining If Jewels Could Talk. You are joining us from your gallery, I think, this morning.
I am, Carol. Yes, I'm sitting here in Pall Mall, surrounded by art, much looking forward to getting stuck into snakes.
But there's a great picture behind you. Could you tell me who that is?
Oh, her. Yes, so she is a 1630s, very grand, ridiculously rich woman in the most intricate black brocaded dress, festooned with gold chains and a watch, and holding a Bible, balancing her earthly wealth with her heavenly aspirations.
It's beautiful. And thank you, Amanda. Hello, thank you for joining us. And you're joining us from Rome, and you have a lot of Roman artwork behind you.
Actually, they are some collage and made by Esmeralda Ruspoli, who had a fetish for snakes. So they're very appropriate. I don't know if the ones behind me, but eyes and snakes feature very prominently in her artwork.
So, Philip, do you think it's right that no other animal features in art as often as the snake or serpent?
Lots of animals gallop, trot through art, probably horses and dogs the most, but the serpent does have a way of enduring throughout, certainly Western art, over a couple of 1,000 years, and you always notice it when you see it. We all respond to snakes, don't we?
We do, and actually I think just doing the research for this podcast actually gave me the creeps. I'm one of the people who sort of veer on the side of fear as opposed to beauty.
But could I just establish myself as a snake supporter?
Okay,
because when we bought our house in the country 20 years ago, the estate agent was clearly trying to put us off because I think she had a favoured buyer. And she said, "You realise there are grass snakes in the garden." She couldn't have said anything more exciting. And for the last 20 years, every summer, I wait for their arrival and I put up a piece of corrugated metal where they warm themselves, and there they are. I find them slightly frightening, but on the whole, I find them compelling.
And Amanda, you're the queen of snakes, having been the head of heritage at Bulgari for so many years with the Serpenti. Do they have a fear for you?
Absolutely not. I definitely stand on the fascination side. And were they not venomous animals, I would not be afraid of them at all. I love their livery, their coloured skins, their smooth, sinuous movement. And if they didn't have to feed on live animals when in captivity, I think I would also consider having them as a pet.
Would you? Even though to me they're completely unlovable. I think.
And I love the way you use the word livery about them. You know, that's such a great word to describe those scales that so many people are frightened of.
Definitely. and they're beautiful.
And so what's attracted artists to try and depict them? Is it the colour, their curving, fluid forms? What is it that attracts artists?
So if I'm to answer that question, I would say it starts with the symbolic power of the serpent. You know, beauty is also about fear. It's the frisson, it's the concept of the sublime. So I think that sort of moment when you look at a snake is part of it. But it's also so much more complex than that. It goes back to this sort of rich, ambiguous symbolism to Egyptian, to Greek and very early Christian times. And yes, it is a symbol of the devil, but it's also a symbol of wisdom. In the medieval period, the snake, the twisting snake on a stick, known as the caduceus, was a symbol of medicine, of curing, you know, the opposite of the killing, venomous nature of the snake. In fact, the World Health Organization today still keeps a snake as a symbol. So I think what artists particularly liked about snakes, regardless of the subject matter, and we could get onto the style and the shape and the curvy, linear, seductive allure of them, but it's about what they instantly get in terms of response from the viewer. And it's not just to do with a disgusting, fearful, sort of venomous head-turning. It's also to do with the fascination that is embodied in many thousands of years of symbolic evolution.
Do you think as humans we had to somehow turn the sort of evil and the venom into something benevolent for us? Hence it's used as something more curative, as you said, and something positive, and we kind of harness that power.
Well, it's sort of the other way round, because if you go back to the really earliest origins of the snake, take Egypt, for example. I mean, the first living creature that came out of primeval earth was the serpent. It was the beginning of life. If you look at Christian history, the serpent, okay, it's the devil, and what a devil. But also, the tree of life was a tree of knowledge, and from that, the world came forth and multiplied. That moment, that snake moment, and then when you add it to the medical application of the snake, in a sense, we've probably had to play with its more evil sides before we've actually talked about its benevolent seminal aspects.
So let's go to that, the Old Testament Bible story in the book of Genesis, which really shaped that evil image when the serpent entered the earthly paradise created for man and woman by God, and the snake convinced Eve to eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of life. Why is that image so widely depicted?
Well, actually, you do often see it, but when you really begin to look into it, it's not that glamorous a moment in art historical iconography, because you've got really your eyes focus on two nude figures. Any opportunity, incidentally, and we'll see that with snakes in old master painting to show people with their kit off, is used. Then there is a tree. And then in the tree is a sly creature. You've also got to show the snake. You've also got to show the apple. So I don't think actually Adam and Eve, even though so many Christian cultures are used to seeing it in illustrations in Bibles and stuff, does come off that well in the canon of old master painting. Yes, you get Albrecht Dürer, the great printmaker, he does one. But it's more for me to do with how the snake is used in other contexts that it gets really slippery exciting.
In other contexts such as?
Well, okay, so probably the most important moment in sculptural history in the West was in 1506. And an excavation was taking place in Rome. And what was being discovered gradually as the earth moved away was so thrilling that even the great Michelangelo was called in to have a look. And they were revealing something that had been hidden in the ground since the 1st century BC or possibly 1st century AD. There is some debate. And it's called the Cowan, which is a sculpture that is probably the most influential in Western art, particularly Renaissance art. A little bit about Cowan. Cowan was a Trojan priest who warned the Trojans that the horse that had entered the city could well be full of Greeks. And the Greek gods at the time, who were a rather petulant, irascible lot in those days, they were so pissed off that he had warned the Trojans against this ruse that they ordered 2 sea serpents to come out of the sea and strangle him and his 2 children. And this scene was portrayed by an unknown Greek, probably it began with Greek and then it was copied by Roman sculpture. This scene, Greek-Roman, that had been excavated, is so dynamic, is so powerful, is so terrifying, is so beautiful that art basically changed thereafter. And what does it consist of? 2 snakes writhing, twisting, suffocating. Cowan himself, whose face is looking heavenwards with a look of agony, his 2 sons looking on. But through all the pain, through all the horror, is the most exquisite, rippling continuity, a curvilinear beauty that is the foundation of the Baroque movement that comes out of the Renaissance, and then subsequently seen in all sorts of other forms, including the Rococo and Art Nouveau. It was immediately taken to the Vatican, so a place made for it, so a key place. Napoleon took it to Paris during the wars. And this crystallization of the ultimate epic beauty of snakes becomes the most seminal image, I think, in Western art. Unfortunately, they were strangled to death. But it's the artistic triumph over it. You see, what it showed was here are 3 figures larger than life in marble, being bound together with this exhilarating coherence as a result of the twisting, turning nature of the snakes holding them together. It creates a structure within the snakes. Create a structure within the structure, and in such a powerful and unforgettable way, it habilitates the snake into art, or rather the serpentine line, which is so associated with the snake, that I think we can see resonating, through Bulgaria and beyond.
So, Amanda, tell me, was it the first mythological symbol used in ancient jewels by the Greek and Romans in a similar way?
The serpent is definitely one of the animals that is represented very frequently in jewels in the ancient Western world. And however, in jewellery, it is a more benign symbol. Often it's a symbol of fertility. And obviously its coils are very suited for being worn as a bracelet. So one tends to find a lot of armlets or bracelets in antiquity. In the Greek world, one finds spectacular examples in the Hellenistic period, that is to say the 3rd century BC. There's a wonderful example, double serpents joined by a cabochon garnet. But the real sort of boom, if one can say, or fashion for serpent jewellery really comes in the 1st century AD, in the early imperial Roman times. And one can find evidence of serpents being worn in multiples. For example, in ancient Roman statues, one can see women depicted wearing up to 5 serpent bracelets and armlets. Obviously, an armlet is a bracelet worn high on the arm, and a bracelet is the serpent coiled around the wrist. And recent excavations or archaeological excavations have revealed a great number of these serpents. And in Roman times, they tend to be entirely of gold without gemstones.
And why do you think they wore 5? Was that decorative effect?
Well, in Roman imperial time, it was a time of extreme luxury, which the earlier Romans would have frowned upon because they considered it sort of a symbol of decadence. But I mean, I think it was all this opulence and wealth, and it was just fashionable. We'll see later on even Diana Reland calling to wear many serpents in one go. It was a fashionable motif, and I presume that they just enjoyed wearing lots of jewellery. But I think what is interesting is that if one is not fond of snakes, I don't think you would wear many jeweled snakes. So obviously Roman ladies.
I would have been out of fashion in Roman times, that's for sure.
Exactly. You have to be a rectifier.
But I think that's what's so interesting, is I think you put your finger on the sort of the inner conflict, because it is a combination of revulsion to some, but extraordinary beauty to others, to do with the innate curvilinear nature of the creature. And I think that that goes some way to understanding the allure. It's aesthetic, symbolic.
But in paintings, primarily, don't they signal evil or imminent danger? Isn't that the kind of shorthand way to deliver that message?
Most definitely. And the most dry-mouthed moment I've had in an art gallery in 10 or 20 years was in Vienna in the Kunsthistorische Museum, when I turned a corner and walked slap into Medusa's severed head by Rubens. Medusa's hair alive with snakes. Just briefly, Medusa, slain by Perseus, one of the Gorgons, had the capacity to turn her enemies to stone just by looking at her. In fact, I know some people like that, actually, still today. And so Perseus cut off her head and then used the head, held it up and used it as some sort of hideous, inhumane weapon to turn other people into stone. But what Rubens has done, working, I think, with Snyders, who helped him do animals, he had a very well-organized studio, is produced a really brilliantly repulsive image. I mean, you could see the dying, writhing snakes. You know, he's such a master of the Baroque brush that it's almost in this static form as if they're moving. You see a sort of lizard thrown in, just sort of watching the whole thing, with beautiful, as you would say, Amanda livery. And the dead eyes of Medusa, who you know has the power to turn someone to stone even in death, combined with the sort of anatomical, exotic disgust of the snakes, is up there, because I'm not really frightened by old master paintings, because, you know, it's a bit like opera, a lot of old master painting. It's quite sort of formalized, but you know, this really was a gizzard getter, this one.
Incidentally, what is quite interesting is that the blood coming from Medusa's severed head was transformed into coral, and that's why coral has is apotropaic. You wear coral to be protected. So there's a link between the head and the blood of Medusa and coral, and that's one of the meanings of coral in jewellery. And you find, for example, babies and the rattle with coral. It's to protect. You find, and that is the reason. That's where it comes from.
That's very good, yes, because a lot of Elizabethan portraiture has babies. The children are shown holding a piece of teething coral.
Exactly, and it also had this apotropaic significance to evil, sort of keep away evil.
But Medusa was depicted by quite a few artists. And I wonder, do you think it was the fable about it, or was it the chance to create that dark vision of these writhing animals?
Well, I mean, Medusa, on the scale of horror, is really up there, isn't she? I think we see probably more Cleopatra actually, who killed herself in the most picturesque way by applying an asp to her breast. And a number of artists right up to the 20th century, including Gustav Klimt, used this image, used the snake image. We also see it in Henri Rousseau. We see snakes, but in another form. But back to Cleopatra, it touches upon another aspect of the serpent, and that is its sort of erotic, slightly phallic quality. And for old master painters, it gave them the opportunity, with the scene of Cleopatra, to hold something snaky in that phallic form, sometimes it seems to look, held against the breast of the person who is committing suicide. It's heavy stuff, but it's also highly charged.
But that's interesting. It has that androgynous feel, the snake, doesn't it? Because as you referred to the sort of phallic shape of it and the way it's used in that as that sort of symbol in art, I think in jewellery it's used much more as a sign of the feminine, isn't it, Amanda? Because that sort of the coiled shape is the female, isn't it?
Definitely. I don't think in jewellery it has that heavy stuff that Philip was referring to. And it has a more positive, and I think it's in the majority of instances, it's less sinister. And as I said, if you're in the category of person who's afraid of snakes, I don't think even a gold or gem encrusted example can persuade you to be adorned by a snake. However, in general, snakes in jewellery do tend to be more benign. And what is interesting is, for example, often you find it in jewellery, the snake devouring its head. And that, in that way, it forms a circle. And so in that instance, the symbol is really the symbol of eternity. The circle is a symbol of eternity. And hence the serpent biting its tail is also a symbol of eternity, the continuity of the cycles of life and death and rebirth. In particular, that symbol is known as the Ouroboros, and it comes from an ancient Greek word, and it is a compound, in fact, of ura, which means tail, and boros, which means devouring. So it's the head devouring, the tail devouring serpent.
And that sparked a new fashion in snake jewellery, didn't it, when Queen Victoria had that exact symbol as an engagement ring?
Exactly. Well, Queen Victoria received from Prince Albert in 1839 a very charming snake ring. It was set with an emerald on its head, because it was the birthstone of Victoria, ruby eyes, and it had also some diamonds. And in Victorian times, at that time, in a specific time, it was very important also the symbolism of the gemstones, which would have reinforced the message. So, for example, rubies and diamonds, rubies are for passion, diamonds are forever, plus the symbol of the serpent, obviously the message is love forever. If one also wants to read the emerald as symbol of hope, well, let's hope love is forever.
And thinking of the snake as a sort of more positive aspect, Philip, I think sometimes they've been used, as you said, to reflect wisdom and reason, judgment. I wondered if you thought that was the reason the snake was in. There's a famous portrait in London's National Portrait Gallery of Elizabeth I, which recently revealed that she had originally been holding a snake. Is that right?
Yes, so the iconography of Elizabeth I is a wonderfully complex and rich subject. She was goddess of the Golden Age. She reigned over a period of tremendous achievements for Britain, for England, abroad and at home. And being this complex virgin queen figure, which they weren't, Britain wasn't quite used to, they deified her, turned her into a Straea, goddess of the golden age. And so some of the most wonderful moments in Elizabethan painting, when you're going down a stately house corridor with a torch, is when you come across one of these immensely ornate icons from the 16th century. And Elizabeth I is at the epicenter of this symbolic cult. And the picture you're referring to at the National Portrait Gallery was X-rayed recently. It was painted about 1580 on panel and anonymous. And there, behind a posy, was the artist's first idea. It's called a pentamente, which is sort of Italian for regret. They're the thing that you decide not to put in there. And the artist had included a snake. And so she was holding as a symbol of wisdom this, at the center of the composition, something which was powerfully appropriate to Elizabeth as part of this sort of cult of this complex semi-goddess figurehead. But clearly the artist, and for reasons that we're touching on today, decided, even though it was symbolically appropriate, that so many potential viewers of the painting would likely recoil from this very centrally placed snake, that he, or possibly she, thought better of it, painted it out. So only an X-ray can now find it.
So it was covered by some flowers, roses?
Yes, yeah. I mean, a sort of the artist added a second campaign, as it were, to the dress area and her fingers, painted out the snake and put in, I think, I need to have another look at it, but I think a posy, some little flowers. And the snake was gone forever until the powers of X-ray re-revealed him.
So do you think that should go back to its original snakely form?
Well, that's a very good ethical question, because we have this a lot. I think when the artist decides to paint something, I think you leave it, you don't touch it. If later restorers, however, and this happened a lot, decided to remove a snake from a picture because it frightened the kids or whatever, then yeah, I would take it off. But in this instance, no, I think it must remain encased within the sovereign's bodice.
And there it's sort of used as a kind of life force to, as you say, to create that that impact about Elizabeth and all she stood for.
Yes.
Amanda, you've referred to the snake goddess and jewellery being used as a sign of fertility. What form would that take? Would it be something different about the snake? Would it be a different embellishment? What form would that take?
In jewellery, it takes really, it's always the coiled snake, and it depends, it's known as a symbol of fertility, symbol of wisdom, symbol of eternity in the benign sense. And I presume if you're wearing it on your body, and also probably as protective, as protection against the evil. Its forms vary over time. Like we saw in Roman times, it was just gold. In Victorian times, for example, it's very interesting. One tends to find a lot of snakes set with turquoise. And that again reinforces the sentimental message. Turquoise is the colour of the forget-me-not. So wearing a serpent that is a symbol of eternity, because quite often they're necklaces where the tail is inserted in the mouth to close the necklace. So you have the circular serpent coupled by the turquoise, which is associated to the forget-me-not. And then you probably have also ruby eyes, which is ruby stands for passion and love. Again, the message is it's a sentimental jewel. It's don't forget to love me or love is forever. So in that respect, one can read these different codes. And for the Victorian wearer, the particular choice of gemstones would have had a very clear and specific meaning, which nowadays we have lost, we have to decode.
So we've got very different images of snakes happening here, because I'm thinking also of the kind of life force of the snake in the self-portrait by Paul Gauguin, Philip, which again is, it's used in quite a sort of menacing way, even though there are plants and flowers in the foreground of that artwork. What does that symbolise?
So this is Gauguin, who was a complex, self-destructive, but also a brilliant figure. It's him. He's holding the snake in this portrait, and his head is rather sort of Gorgon-like or Medusa-like and sort of dismembered. It's sort of floating, and then you've got the snake in his hand. I mean, he's using it, I think, as we've been sort of touching upon in this conversation, for it's sort of uncomfortable, rather devil, Satan-like symbolic powers, I feel. And also it had allowed him to produce a beautiful bit of yellow wriggle into a rather tight composition. And this is something that's, I just need to return to, if I may, because I think one of the reasons that the snake is so compelling is because of its inherent beauty, because of its curvilinear contours. And one of the most beloved artists of the 18th century, William Hogarth, the savage satirist, but also portrait painter, took it to heart. He wrote this book called The Analysis of Beauty, and in it he defined, amongst other aspects, but predominantly, the serpentine line, the ogee, as he called it, as the absolute quintessence of what art should be about in terms of aesthetics, the curve and twist of the snake. And what you need to do, go to the Tate Gallery, walk into the 18th century room, and there meet William Hogarth, a self-portrait by him, and he's sitting there with his pug dog. But on his palette is written the words, or worse, the effect of the serpentine line or the ogee line, and he's beautifully painted a snake shape. Now, you can play a wonderful game with Hogarth because he saw this as the way to produce basically any work of art, any painting of beauty. Look at the crowd scenes and the way the feet are arranged along the floor. Look at the profiles of his portraits. Look at the objects that are included. Even sometimes look at the architecture. He's forever looking for the serpentine line of beauty, which philosophically he crystallized as the absolute essence of what art needs to achieve in order to convey its sort of highest ambitions.
That's interesting, because I think this serpentine line of beauty is something every fine jeweller also tries to master, don't you think, Amanda? If we think
Absolutely.
of Cartier, Boucheron, Bulgari, David Webb, I mean, every jeweller has a snake that reflects their sensibilities to try and master that line.
Definitely, and then even earlier, I mean, the Art Nouveau, French Art Nouveau masters, for example, Lalique and Georges Fouquet, obviously the whiplash line, the serpentine line, is absolutely key to all the movement and also in jewellery. So, for example, the two French artists, it's not surprising that they used to great effect serpents in their compositions. However, what is interesting is that the Art Nouveau, the serpents, tend to be a bit more sinister than the 20th and 21st century serpents created by jewelers. And another characteristic, for example, of the Art Nouveau jewels is the emphasis more on the design and the serpentine line as opposed to the intrinsic materials. And in fact, the Art Nouveau artists tend to use enamel, opalescent enamel or open back enamel that looks like a sort of a miniature stained glass window.
For people listening who are not sure about the Art Nouveau period, it was a short period at the end of the 19th century when a completely new style was created in reaction to machine-made, mass-produced jewellery. And it had free-floating forms and very much focused on the natural world, didn't it, Amanda? And the structure of form and a naturalistic approach. And I guess the snake was ideal for that.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the most magnificent corsage ornaments of Lalique doesn't have one snake or dragon, but I think about 6 or 7. So he definitely played with this fantastic, sinuous form, and also the ambiguity, of its meaning, this sort of sinister, positive. But later jewellery designers definitely don't play on the sinister and malevolent aspect of the serpent. For example, you mentioned Bulgari. Bulgari was, let's say, an innovator in the 20th century in terms of the fact that they associated the snake with a watch. And that was a first.
I think they associated the snake with sex appeal.
Possibly. They made it sexy and also, let's say, useful. However, the dial is very small and it's difficult to read the time. However, in the early ones, what is interesting that the first Bulgari snakes, which date approximately to the 1940s, tend to be stylized. They are just formed of a coiled gold bracelet, and the head of the snake is suggested by the dial of the watch, which usually is circular or pear-shaped. It was only later, from the late 50s onwards until the 70s, that they began creating very naturalistic snakes, paint in gold, and they were covered in enamel, and sometimes the colours chosen mimicked the actual colours of the livery or of the skin of a real species, of a real type of snake. And the head of the snake was hinged and concealed the watch. So when you look at it, it is a perfectly formed serpent. And then to see the time, you lift up the head, and underneath you'll find the watch. So that is Bulgari.
And this was the moment, as you referred to, that the Vogue editor, the legendary Vogue editor Diana Vreeland, said, "Don't forget the serpent. It should be on every finger and all wrists. The serpent is the motif of the hour in jewellery. We cannot see enough of them."
Definitely. And she, in fact, personally owned a Bulgari huge gold, pale pink and white enamel snake belt. So it was very large, but she enjoyed wrapping it rather than around her waist, around her neck, to create maximum impact. So this huge gold enamel serpent with sapphire eyes was wrapped around Diana Vreeland's neck.
Like a python.
Absolutely.
You could call it the Cleopatra syndrome.
Yes, definitely.
And I have to say, I like the idea that there's an element to this, the frisson of the power dresser being able to conquer and dominate something frightening and evil. What's lovely is when you show snake jewellery to children. You get the sort of the literal response, so they love it. That's what you're doing, aren't you? You've wrestled a snake to the ground when you've put it on your fingers. You have incorporated it. It's part of your menagerie.
You've sort of tamed it, really. You've
tamed it. That's the word.
So, is there any? Are snakes ever sexy in art, as they have been in jewellery?
Oh yes. So I think going back to the Cowan, the most seminal sculpture of the Renaissance, although it was Roman. Yes, the idea of a snake being something that, and I'm making no distinction here between sexy to the eye and sexy literal. Sexy to the eye is something just deeply satisfying that takes you on a walk with a beginning and an end and leaves you better for it. I see that throughout art. And in the 20th century, there are some, and 21st century, there have been some lovely moments. There's a beautiful Rousseau who does those jungle scenes. I think it's called the Snake Charmer, and he has them sort of hanging like fruit, sort of dropping into the foreground of the picture, producing wonderful sort of slightly snaky verticals. And then recently, in a literal way, almost as terrifying as the head of Medusa by Rubens, was that work by Polly Morgan, which was half taxidermy and half art form, which showed a coiled snake in a piece of polystyrene. It created a lot of interest, and The Guardian and others did articles on it. But it was almost as if she was saying, okay, let's go back to really enjoying just how terrifying a snake can be. And by a combination of the naturalism of the skin of the snake and the enhancement of the context in this piece of polystyrene and the added bits and pins and whatever, enamel or whatever, I have no idea what she was using. My goodness me, it put the snake back into snake.
I think also she was trying to make a metaphor for peeling back the skin, like the snake sloughs off its skin and becomes something else. And I thought, for me, for a sort of modern take on the snake, as we've been going through these extraordinarily different times, it sort of made a very good metaphor for that.
Well, I think that's a wonderful point, and it takes us in a serpentine way full circle, because I think one of the reasons that the snake in Greek and medieval times was an image opposite to what we've been talking about of health and cure was the fact that it could constantly be reborn by shedding its skin. So this is an aspect that we haven't really touched upon today, but that fabulously positive nature of reoccurring life. And Polly in her work, in her very slimily beautiful work, has touched upon it again.
And I guess, Amanda, the Art Deco jewellers, as technologies improved and they were able to make the snake more articulated.
More snaky.
More snaky, and give it that sort of articulated movement.
Definitely. Technology plays a very important part in jewellery, and there are various ways. They're incredibly labour intensive, but in order to create these objects that with scale-like motifs that are articulated, that you can wrap round your wrist and they keep their form, it's technically very challenging. And the way one achieves that is by inserting a spring inside the body. And usually the spring is white gold, because white gold keeps its shape. So so not only it's gold in the exterior, but you find a white gold spring in the interior of the object. And they're phenomenally labour intensive and require very high levels of skill in order to make them. Talking about sexy, I think it's also sort of the pleasure for who is a reptophile. It's the pleasure of the weight, and I mean to carry the weight of of a snake. And I must say I had a buzz when I was allowed only for a few minutes to wear the Maria Felix snake made by Cartier. Now, Maria Felix was a very extravagant, rather reptophile actress. She was Mexican, larger than life. And she commissioned Cartier a spectacular snake necklace in 1968. It took 1 year to produce. It was finished in 1969. And it's set with more than 2,500 diamonds for a total weight of 172 carats. But on the top, there are diamonds. And on the bottom side, there are the scale-like body of the serpent in green, red, and black enamel, and the snake overlaps on the neck, and so it's really like wearing a boa constrictor, but it's a heavy one, very sparkly, and it is for who enjoys snakes. It's a wonderful jewel to be able to wear and enjoy.
Philip, as we talked about the technology in jewellery changing the image, figurative image of a snake, have there been painting techniques and styles that have altered what you see as the image of the snake? For instance, for me, just as a lay person looking at some of the Victorian pictures by Burne-Jones or John Collier, they look so much softer and romantic, and I wonder if that has something to do with the painting style or just the subject that they're put into.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I wonder whether it has something to do with the zoo culture as well, because I mean we can, in England it's difficult to find a snake when you want it, but
well, they're obviously all at your house, that's why.
I mean, I think they would have been more around in order to copy and paint and replicate in the 19th century, because of the sort of the animal collecting culture, which was underpinned obviously by empire and the bringing back of objects. There's one wonderful painter who was a friend of the Bloomsbury group, and his name was Simon Bussy. He was a Frenchman and a friend of Matisse, and he did the most glorious images of snakes. He came over to England and he did them in pastel, and he went to London Zoo, and he would just watch them and paint them and draw them. And this was all around about sort of 1910, 20, 30. And his capacity to convey their serpentine virtues so well in his medium of pastel was the fact that he was looking at them in the life. And obviously so much of what we're talking about in design is abstracted, is the sort of design essence of a snake. But it's quite good every now and then just to go and remind you of what these creatures look like, and from an artistic point of view, it's enriching.
I want to know, Amanda, do you own any jewelled snakes? And if you don't, what era would you want to?
Of course, I own snakes. It's my chance to have them. I own some Bulgari snake watches and just plain snakes. So, but all in precious materials. So, unfortunately, I had a very beautiful example of archaeological revival snake, which was second half of the latter part of the 19th century, when jewelers were imitating the style of ancient Greek and Roman goldsmiths, following all the archaeological finds that were occurring at the time. And I had one of those. It was actually one of my first acquisitions, and it was stolen. So that was a big loss, but it was a wonderful snake. It was braided gold, that wrapped around about 4 times around the wrist.
Philip, any snakes in the gallery at the moment? What do you have on show?
Snakes. No, we're quite low on snakes at the moment, but after this I'm going to go out and try and find some.
Philip, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that with us and giving us a quick tour through snakes in art. And Amanda, likewise, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about the culture of snakes in jewellery. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. For more information about this and other episodes of If Jewels Could Talk, please go to our website, carolwoolton.com, and if you liked it, please share it any way you can. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on any of the usual platforms where you find your podcasts, where we'd love a rating and a comment. Please join us again in 2 weeks for the next Jewelled Nugget. You must have noticed the big fashion for chains in jewellery right now. I'm going to talk to the king of chains himself, Chifa de Saifa, a Londoner of Ghanaian heritage, and he is the star of Channel 4's High Life, a docu-series following the lives and loves of a group of ambitious, glamorous young British West Africans. We're going to talk about music, sport and jewellery. Please join me then. Goodbye. If Jewels Could Talk with Carol Woolton is produced by Natasha Cowan, music and editing by Tim Thornton, graphics by Scott Bentley, illustration by Jordi Labanda, and you can find me on Instagram at Carol Woolton.